Hey guys, this is Simona. I know you're used to Brian making these videos, but I'm gonna be helping record some of them to hopefully produce the content faster for you. So as the title suggests, today we're going to take everything we've learned about animating tails and bring it together into one single exercise. We got inspired for this one by Kiara from the YouTube channel I Want to Be an Animator. She's an amazing artist and we thought her jump and spin was the perfect way to end the tail series. I went ahead and animated a very similar cartoony jump and added some height difference using this platform here. The principles are the same as for a regular bouncing ball exercise, but they are pushed to look more cartoony. Feel free to download our example file and study the animation to see how we did it. We can even make a video tutorial if you like, just let us know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. So before we dive into animating the tail, let's look at our finished example animation and analyze it a bit. Every time we've animated the tail so far, we either determined if it's just an accessory or if it's alive and moves on its own like an animal's tail. In the seaweed tutorial, the tail was alive and moving without being affected by the ball. But in the overshoot and settle video, we had the tail hanging down and all of the movement was caused by the motion of the ball. Well, today we're gonna be doing a bit of both. We'll start by giving the tail a nice curved shape so it's not completely limp on this platform. As the ball squashes to gather energy for the jump, we will swing the tail sideways to the right using its own muscles to help the ball propel for the jump and especially for the spin. But once the ball gains speed, we will have the tail just drag behind the ball. At high speeds, you don't want to be adding any secondary animation because it would make the action convoluted and really hard to read. So only after the overshoot is done and the ball comes to a stop, the tail will use its own muscles to settle into a nice final pose like we have here. And of course, we will be adding offset, drag, C and S curves, and everything else we've learned so far about animating tails and anything that follows the principles of seaweed animation. This exercise is definitely a tricky one to get right, so we'll be doing lots of back and forth adjusting along the way, but that's okay and it's expected. So let's start with our exercise file that has the finished ball bounce, but none of the actual tail animation. Let me play it once for you. So you can see the bouncing ball animation is done and the tail is just stiff without any animation on it. And in this exercise, that's what we're gonna be focusing on. But like I said before, if you're interested in seeing how to animate this cartoony jump, let us know and we'll make a lesson for you. So like I said, first of all, we should grab all these controllers on the tail and make sure we have a key on the first frame, just pressing I and key in all channels. And let's give the tail a nice starting pose. So I can zoom in a little bit to see better. And I'm just gonna push this one up a little bit, grab the second and third controller, swing them upwards, and curve the final controller the other way to get a nice curve on the tail, which I think looks more interesting than having it look like this. But if that's what you like, of course you can do that. You can do whatever you want with the tail. And then for this type of exercise, because the tail is being affected by the motion of the ball, we kind of have to do a lot of just scrubbing and seeing what the tail should look like at any particular point. So for me, for example, here we talked about using the tail to help propel the ball for the spin. Since the ball is going to be spinning counterclockwise this way, we want to first spin the tail in the other direction. So since we want to use the tail to help propel the ball for the spin, we can look at our example animation. Here we have the ball travel to the right, then swing the other way to push the ball into the spin, right? So if the ball is spinning counterclockwise this way, then the tail has to go in the other direction first so it can swing back and push it into that counterclockwise motion. So around here where the ball has reached its maximum rotation and squash before it propels itself for the jump, we want to have the tail in that extreme position. So I'm going to grab the tail 1 controller, rotate the tail sideways to get the pose, and I'm going to push it this way a little bit. And I want this curve of the tail to be stronger than it is now, so I'm going to grab the third controller, shape it better. And because the tail is moving towards the right, we want the tip of the tail to be dragging behind and following the path as well. So let me rotate it in that direction as well. And I'm also checking my camera view, and I feel like my tail is a little high, so what I can do is grab this controller, bring it down a little bit so I can still see it, but it's more aligned with the ball now. So let's grab and see what it looks like. Okay, so already the tail is doing what we would expect it to do, but of course we'll be adding more poses to this area later, but let's just see what comes after this. So as the ball starts leaving the ground, we want the tail to be swinging in the other direction. So it came in this way, now it swings the other way to help the ball rotate. So let me grab this controller, rotate it the other way, and the tip controller as well, and give it a nice shape to propel the ball for the spin. So before I brought the controller lower so I don't see the tail sticking up so much, but now all my motion is kind of hidden behind, so maybe I'll just bring it a little higher so I can see it. Then through here we just want the tail to be dragging behind the ball, which the shape is correct, but the thing is, to make the drag look even more believable, we want the tip of the tail to be pointing down, right? Because the ball is traveling up, that means the tip of the tail should still be dragging behind, and the angle of the tail, instead of being this way, should be a little bit more down. So I'm just going to grab the main controller or the tail 1 controller, rotate it down, and that looks about right. And going to this pose on frame 22, we see that the tail is very far from the ball, but with the amount of spin that's going on, the tail should be a lot closer to the ball. It shouldn't be this far away. So let's try and bring it closer and shape it that way, where it's pretty much hugging the ball. And I'm using the tip of the tail to reinforce that direction, where the tail is still dragging behind. So now that I animated to camera and this pose looks good, I can go to the previous pose and I can see that the tail was indeed far from the ball, even though we can't see it in the camera view. So what I can do is grab all these controllers on the tail, and because this frame is correct, or how I want it to look, I can key all those controllers on frame 22, and then on frame 21 I'm just going to delete what I had there. So now we can see the animation corrects itself and the tail is a lot closer to the ball, and from our perspective view it's not intersecting the ball, so it should be fine. So two things: you always want to make sure things look good in camera view, but then don't forget to also be checking stuff in your perspective, because there might be things you don't see from this particular angle that can help your animation. Around here the ball starts hovering and moving sideways, so this is where the tail would start catching up. So before it was dragging, and now it's gonna do a little bit of an overshoot where it starts hovering above the ball a little bit, creating this kind of shape I'm doing with my mouse. So let's do that. Let's grab all of these controllers on the tail, key it, and you always want to make sure you're keying everything that you like, because let's say I like the pose of this tail 3 controller right here the way it is, but if I don't key it and then change it on this frame, it's gonna affect my previous frame. So I always want to make sure everything that is said by me and I like is keyed. So here I think the tail should be hovering. I'm gonna rotate it up, and you can be gentle with this base controller, it doesn't have to move as much. We can use the tail 2 controller to do more of those bigger changes on the tail. And you can use these axes on the tail, or you can use this big white circle around if you're animating the camera, which is fine in this case. Bring it up. Let's grab the tail 3 controller, bring the tail up, and with the tip of the tail we still want it to be pointing down, because obviously it's still dragging behind more than the rest of the tail. And in terms of how close it is to the body, I feel like now it can start floating away a little bit, and it's giving us a better result in the camera view. So basically what I'm after is this shape of the tail. Let's see what that looks like. I have a feeling that it would look better to have this shape on like 1 or 2 frames before, because since the ball is now moving sideways, I feel like the tip of the tail at this point would be catching up and be more straight. So let me grab all those controllers and move my animation from frame 30 to like frame 29. And then around frame 32, again, I'm gonna create a key. Now the tip of the tail is not dragging down anymore. It's dragging into that sideways direction. So that's a big thing with the drag. We talked about this a little bit before. Because the tail right now is not having any of its own animation, it's just purely dragging behind. You always want to make sure the tip of the tail, or just the tail in general, is following the motion of the ball. It's not going to be like pointing up. This is kind of the pose I want around this frame. Let's actually also play the animation. Okay, so up until that point it looks pretty good. Obviously we'll be adding more poses, but we're blocking in the poses for the main motion first. So now the ball is starting to travel down, which means the tail wants to travel up because it's dragging behind, and the tip of the tail wants to follow that previous path, so the shape is gonna be a little bit like this. If you can feel that just by playing it. Now again, I'm gonna use the gizmo in my camera view as well, just because I want to be rotating the controllers based on the camera view a little bit. And the tail starts going up too fast around frames 34 and 35, but we'll fix that later. Let's just continue going. This pose around frame 37 looks good. Let's go down. So around frame 41, the ball has picked up a lot of speed, meaning the only drag on the tip of the tail that's happening is the up and down drag. So I want to make sure also, when I look at it from the top view, if I press 7, that at this point my tail is kind of aligned with the ball. It's not like pointing sideways or anything, because again, the ball is not traveling side to side this way, it's just traveling up and down. I'm gonna make those corrections right here. And that's something you can't really see from the camera view that well, but you want to correct it from your perspective view. So in terms of the ball being aligned with the ball this way, and this way it looks better now. And now I need to grab the tip of the tail, and it's kind of pointing away, so I just want to straighten it out like that. And I can push it a little bit more so it's perfectly straight. So anything that happens on the tail after this point is gonna be pretty much the same as in the bouncing ball with tail exercise, because the ball is just bouncing up and down, so I'm gonna treat it as such. So I know that while the ball is still traveling down and hitting the ground, the tail is gonna have the same shape, and then once the ball changes direction, it's gonna have the S curve, and then eventually it's gonna have the opposite C curve. So right now I'm on frame 41, and then 42, 43, the ball is still traveling down, and this is where on frame 44, this is where we're gonna start seeing the change of direction. So on frame 43, I'm gonna key my tail to make sure that this pose stays intact. Now, figuring out the perfect S-curve for this motion is a little tricky, so let's go past it, and on the way up, we know that the tail is gonna have an opposite C-curve. The thing is, the ball isn't jumping as high anymore, so these C-curves won't be as sharp as they were when the ball was turning down and traveling at a high speed here. So let's see what we get. So the base controller will be going down a little bit, and then the rest of the tail will be pointing down as well. Right now it looks like a little bit of an S curve, so let me push it and create more of a C curve. So we have a downward facing C curve on frame 46, and then as we scrub around frame 55, the ball has picked up enough speed again, and the ball should have the opposite C curve. So let's do that. And I'm helping myself with the gizmo in the camera view. And I really don't want the C curve to be super sharp anymore because the ball barely has any speed at this point. This looks like plenty to me. And at this point, at the end, when it's just doing little bounces, there won't really be any distinct C curves anymore. It's gonna be more of like a S curve wiggle on the tail. So let's try that. The ball is traveling up until frame 59. So this is where we'll have the maximum C curve going in the opposite direction. So let's start shaping that. Again, the base of the tail will be more subtle. And as we work our way towards the end of the tail, it's gonna be a little bit more pronounced. But at this point, this might not look like a C curve anymore, but I don't want the tip of the tail to be flapping around too much. So let's keep it like this for now and see if we need to push it later. So here on frame 63 is the maximum bottom pose. That means we need to reverse the tail. So before we animate that final pose, let me just quickly animate the rest of this settle on the tail and we'll be back. Okay, so this looks decent enough. I could maybe push it a little bit on some poses. So towards the end, it's a lot of tweaky work. You just gotta make sure that you continue doing those C and S curves on the tail. And mine looks like this right now. And it's not fully settled, but the reason why I didn't do that is because I actually want to create that final pose for the tail that's gonna look kind of like the first pose, where it's a nice curve going up and then the tip of the tail is pointing the other way. And because that's gonna be a motion going upwards, I don't need the tail to settle to a final stop. So let me grab all of these controllers and maybe around frame 72 key them and try and pose the tail. These ones going up and the tip of the tail going the other way. And let's just play it to see what's happening. Okay. So the transition is pretty smooth, but a couple of problems. Right now, all of our controllers get to that final pose at the same time and they just ease into it and stop. We want to make sure we still have some drag happening, and for that reason, I'm gonna grab this base controller and the tail 2 controller, and instead of having them on 72, I'll have them happen earlier around frame 70. And I'm gonna take the tail 3 and move it to frame 71. Just so the tip of the tail arrives later than the rest of the tail. And it also feels like, because it's such a big motion, I should have some overshoot and settle even here. So I'll grab this frame 71, Control C, Control V to like frame 75. And here I'm just gonna create an overshoot by pushing the tail past this final pose. So now it goes past and goes back, but we know that the tip of the tail needs to overlap. So let's push it down, and then it turns direction, and it settles way too fast here. So let's bring that to maybe frame 77. on this frame 64, I'm gonna just push the tip of the tail up to reinforce that C-curve here. And delete this key where it snaps abruptly. Again, I'm gonna push the drag on frame 68. And it seems like the tail needs to continue dragging through here. And more time to settle. And maybe it won't settle and set into such an extreme position. So maybe around frame 78, I'm gonna key it, delete frame 80. And that looks a lot better. I just feel like the tail swings up just a little too fast in general. So I'll grab all of my keys and just give it a little bit of extra time through here. Even just one frame helps. So let's leave that for now and let's go back to the beginning where we haven't really finished animating between frame 1 and frame 15. So the ball is moving slightly up and away from us before it goes into this squash and moves more towards us. So I'm gonna actually help it with the tail too. So as the ball is going up, our tail, because it's not really animated right now, it's going down too much. So let's push the tail back up. So now the tail is more or less maintaining its previous position from frame 1. And because the tail is going to be going to the left here, let's make it go to the right before that, so it has a nice little swing to it. Just very subtly, tail moves to the right, then to the left. Here we can push the tip of the tail. It creates a nice arc. And now we can reinforce that direction by pushing the tail to be more flat. Now it snaps and starts spinning. And through here, I feel like the tip of the tail can already be hovering a little bit more. So let's do that. And whenever you have two keys next to each other, depending on the situation, but you might want to delete the one that was already there before, just so the values don't snap from one to the other over one frame. So if I know that this position on frame 31 is the one I want to keep, I'll just delete the key on frame 32. And now this is the spot we talked about before, where the tail suddenly travels up and the tip of the tail is also traveling up. So what we need to do is just, again, the tip of the tail needs to follow the previous path, so it's going to be curved down. And we can delete the frame after. And that helps it pop back into that position where it's supposed to be. So if you're just following the very tip of the tail here, you can see it having this nice smooth arc until here where it starts curving, which we don't really want yet. So let's make it more straight. And again, this is the pose we just did, but it needs some adjusting. Which is okay, that's how animation works. You continue adjusting stuff until it looks right. And let's play it. So now I feel like we could be more snappy in this area where the tail goes from being here to being all the way on the other side. I want it to be snappier in the way it gets there. So let's look at it from our perspective view so we see what's actually happening. So the tail takes time to get to this pose and then it snaps over 2 frames. So let's grab those keys and we can give it more time around here from frame 15 to frame 18 to change direction, and at the same time shorten the time it takes to get from here to here and moving frame 15 to the left by like 2 frames. Now it's a little bit snappier how it gets there. And of course we can drag the tip of the tail through here. And even on this frame to create a nice S-curve before it snaps. So this first part is looking good, and let's just see if there's anything else we need to clean up at the end here. It looks a little bit jittery to me. So scrub until you find something that feels like it needs adjustment. And I think here the base of the tail could change direction just a little bit faster, which allows us to have a little bit more drag on the tip of the tail. I'm gonna delete the key after, just so there isn't any pop on the curve and it's more smooth. And here between this and this frame, this between pose looks a little bit odd. I'm gonna grab all of these controllers, keyframe 59 and keyframe 61, and delete frame 60, and automatically it fixes my curves for me and it looks more appealing to the eye. And I still feel like after the tail settles, the tip of the tail moves too much, so we can either reduce the motion on the tip of the tail here or add a little bit of movement to the previous controller as well. So it's going up, overshoots, goes down. Let's see if it should overshoot again down very slightly. And it looks better. So we had the third controller overshooting on the way up, go down, overshoot just a tiny bit while we're waiting for the tip of the tail to continue its travel and settle to the final pose. And at this point we're pretty much done. Of course there's always a little bit of refinement you could do if you have more time, but if not, it looks decent the way it is now. So these are the main takeaways from the exercise. We have to determine whether the tail is alive or not, and we decided that for the beginning or pretty much throughout the whole animation, the tail is alive. It has its own kind of muscles that are helping it stay upright in a nice pose instead of being limp on this platform, and the tail also helps the ball to propel for the jump. So it's like when you're using your legs on a swing to help yourself swing higher. That's what the tail is doing here. So it's swinging in one direction so it can push the ball up and into the spin. But once the ball gains speed, we want to make sure that we're just dragging the tail behind instead of animating and doing whatever else. And once we get to this point of the animation, it's like our bouncing ball and tail animation where we see a lot of C and S curves. And we gotta be careful when the ball is traveling at a high speed. Around here, the tail has more of a C curve, more of a sharper C curve, but around here, you can see that the C curves are a lot more subtle because there isn't so much speed and momentum to whip the tail in one direction or the other. The bounces become smaller and so are the swings, and then finally the tail settles into its final position that you can make it whatever you want, but this is what mine looks like. And because it's quite a big change from being down here to be up here, we added some overshoot on the tail and then settle. We saw that if we just created one pose and the tail goes from here to here, it just doesn't look natural. Everything stops at the same time and it just gets perfectly into its final pose without any flaw, and it just doesn't look natural. So whenever you have a big change of direction, you kind of want to have an overshoot and a little bit of drag before the tail or whatever you're animating settles. So that's it. If you're doing mentorship, feel free to submit this. This is actually a pretty challenging exercise, so I would suggest doing so. And at the same time, if you feel like this is too easy, what you can do is actually start from the beginning, delete the animation on the bouncing ball, animate it yourself, and then do the tail afterwards. And of course, if your animation looks different from this one in any way, your tail is gonna look also a little bit different, because the tail always depends on what the ball is doing. Okay, so we're done. Hopefully the lesson was helpful. Good luck, and we'll see you in the next one.